I didn't even realize my keys were missing until the cows started screaming. It was one of those mornings where the world feels suspiciously calm. The kind where the coffee tastes better than usual, the sunrise looks painted, and you almost think the universe is giving you a break. I stepped out onto the porch with my travel mug, glanced out over my small farm, and felt something close to peace. My chickens hustled around the coop, the goats stood on my picnic table like drunk acrobats, and the cows were peacefully grazing. Or so I thought, because when I started walking toward the barn, I felt that automatic, subconscious pat to my pocket. The one you do without thinking. The keys weren't there. I checked my other pocket. Nope. I checked my shirt pocket, which has been empty since 2009. Still no keys. I went back inside to check the kitchen counter. Nothing. I wasn't concerned yet. Keys disappear sometimes. They slip into couch cushions, fall into boots, get left on tractors. I'd find them. Except I didn't. By the time I returned outside, my animals had realized breakfast was late, which is absolutely unacceptable in their eyes. The goats bleated like they were calling the police. The cows gathered at the fence, mooing with righteous fury. The chickens formed a riot mob. All right, chill, I muttered as I jogged back to the porch and scanned the ground. That's when I saw the envelope. Perfectly crisp, placed on the top step like a ransom letter. My name in bold black marker. Heart rate, instantly doubled. I opened it. Due to multiple violations of neighborhood standards, we have taken necessary measures to protect the safety and order of the community. Your access is suspended until further notice. Please contact the HOA office to discuss reinstatement. Signed, Interim HOA President, Karen Lindstrom. 2 things stood out. 1. My farm is not in an HOA. 2. My neighbor Karen had apparently lost her last remaining screw. I stood there in disbelief, rereading it, hoping some hidden sentence would appear explaining this was a prank. But what really hammered the insanity home was the final line, handwritten under her signature. P.S. I have your keys. Consider this a warning. I actually laughed. A full-on, coffee spray, bent-over belly laugh. Karen had done some unhinged things over the past year, but this was Olympic-level entitlement. She lived in the newly built subdivision across the road, a place where all the houses were beige squares, every lawn was trimmed like it was joining the military, and everyone drove the same SUV in different shades of boredom. For months, she had been trying to drag me into their HOA. My land is older than the entire neighborhood. I have century-old barn beams and fence posts older than Karen's entire bloodline. But she couldn't stand that I existed outside her control. I was a blot on her manicured universe. Still, stealing my keys? That was a bold leap into lunacy. Animals screaming again. Right. Farm first, fists later. I decided to climb the fence and manually open the barn through the back hatch. It wasn't locked from the inside. But as soon as I landed in the pasture, a shrill voice sliced through the morning air. Excuse me. What do you think you're doing? Karen, in a tracksuit so bright it probably had its own GPS signal, stomped across the road holding my keys like a trophy. I'm feeding my animals, I called back. On my property. Her nose wrinkled like she had smelled freedom and was offended by it. No unauthorized access allowed. You have been banned. From my own farm? Yes. I blinked slowly like my brain was loading an error screen. I wasn't even angry yet, just fascinated. And on what planet do you think this is legal? I'm the acting HOA president. That gives me authority over the entire community. Pretty sure community doesn't include someone who owns 16 acres of non-HOA land. She lifted her chin like a royal chicken. The neighborhood voted. We have extended jurisdiction. Over cows? I asked. She glared. Over everything within community eyesight. The cows, sensing the confrontation, joined me behind the fence. My largest dairy cow, Daisy, let out a powerful moo directly at Karen. I couldn't tell if Daisy was offering moral support or challenging her to a duel. Karen flinched anyway. Don't let that thing yell at me. That's her freedom of speech, I said. This is harassment, she snapped. You will respect the rules. I took a calm breath because sarcasm is far more effective when delivered with serene politeness. Why don't you hop the fence and enforce them, then? She sputtered. I am not stepping foot on that filthy land. Tragic. Her left eye twitched. Good. Pressure was working. You have until this afternoon to comply, she declared. Come to the HOA office, pay a reinstatement fee, and agree to abide by our regulations. Then I will return your keys. What regulations? I asked, pretending to be curious rather than imagining all the ways I could catapult her off my property with a trebuchet. No livestock visible from the street. No farming odors. No vehicles older than 5 years. And the barn will need to be repainted a neutral shade. Beige, preferably. My barn is a deep red piece of American history. Beige would be a hate crime. And if I don't? I asked. Karen smiled. It was the kind of smile that makes you think someone microwaved their ethics. Then you can consider your farm condemned. She turned and walked away like she had just delivered a mic drop. Except she dropped common sense instead. Back to the animals. They needed food, and I wasn't about to let Karen be responsible for starting a farm-wide hunger protest. I climbed up to the loft window, entered, and started morning routines manually. It took twice as long without equipment keys, but eventually peace returned. Cows munching. Goats plotting chaos. Chickens accepting their king's return. By the time I finished, I had decided 2 things. First, I wasn't giving Karen a single penny. Second, I was going to get my keys back, and I was going to make sure she regretted ever thinking she had power over me. But I believed in playing the long game. Outrage is loud. Revenge is quiet and elegant. So instead of confronting her again, I cleaned up, drove my backup truck into town, and visited a friend, Sheriff Daniels. He's known me since high school and has arrested me 0 times, which makes me one of his better acquaintances. When I told him what happened, he paused mid-sip of his morning soda. She stole your keys and is holding your property hostage? Yup. Claims she's expanded the HOA into my land. He rubbed his temples like someone had just handed him a Rubik's Cube made of tax law. She's already called my office 7 times this month with HOA nonsense. But this is a whole new barrel of stupid. So what do you want to do? I asked. He grinned. A slow, mischievous grin. I'll pay her a visit. But let's handle this carefully. Some people only learn when consequences knock on their door politely. And then kick it down. I liked that plan. Very poetic. Driving home, I saw Karen standing on the sidewalk with 2 HOA board members, pointing at my barn, measuring things with a tape measure like they were sizing me up for execution. They looked like overly caffeinated mall cop. Karen made eye contact and gave me a smug little wave with my keys. Perfect. The game was on. And she had already made her first mistake. She thought she was in control. Sheriff Daniels arrived like a man who'd learned to carry patience in his pocket. He listened without interrupting as I explained the envelope, the keys, and Karen's proclamation of authority. When I finished, he folded his hands and said, "She stole your keys. That can be a theft report." His voice was calm, the kind that turns panic into paperwork. The deputy took the report and asked the obvious questions. Where did you last see them? Who else knew about the keys? And wrote everything down in a notebook that smelled faintly of coffee and formality. Legally, you're covered, he said when he handed me a stamped copy. Practically, though, these things get messy. He shrugged like the world is full of messy people and he regretted nothing. Karen didn't stop at social grandstanding. She uploaded a photo to the neighborhood chat. My red barn in the background, her holding my keys like some petty coronation. The caption read, "Protecting our community." The thread unfurled into polite squabbles. A few neighbors offered cautious support. Someone left a casserole on my stoop. The internet's appetite for spectacle is immortal, and Karen fed it with relish. Then the law papers arrived. She filed an injunction claiming my farm was a nuisance and demanding that certain activities cease because they were visible from common areas and harmful to property values. The injunction requested absurdities: repaint the barn in neutral tones, remove any animal structures visible from the road, and consent to HOA inspections. It was a tidy bundle of entitlement dressed up in legalese. I called Priya, who treats legal puzzles like people treat coffee, essential and invigorating. She read the injunction and, after a short, amused silence, said, "They can't enforce HOA covenants on land outside their agreements. This is jurisdiction theater." She sketched a plan with crisp confidence. File a declaratory judgment to quiet title issues, demand return of my property, and be ready to countersue for harassment if they persisted. Her language was precise and practical, which has a way of restoring balance to a world that sometimes mistakes noise for authority. While the lawyers prepared their motions, I decided to wage a subtler battle. I invited the subdivision to an open day at the farm. No protest signs, no rallies, just an ordinary invitation to see the place people accused of being a menace. I baked pies because pies make people comfortable and set out lemonade because sugar is persuasive. The idea was simple: replace rumor with reality. People showed up. Families wandered between apple trees. Kids chased the goats and shrieked with delighted disregard for dignity. Neighbors who had only glimpsed my property from the road walked paths and asked questions. Daisy the cow posed for photos like a stoic celebrity. Even a few members of the HOA drifted across with the wary curiosity of inspectors faced with a familiar stranger. Conversation replaced conjecture. People learned what manure really smells like, and that tractors are less symbolic threats and more essential tools. Deputy Romo, who had filed the report, came by in plain clothes, sipped lemonade, and pretended his existence was a soft rebellion against the seriousness of grown-ups. Karen arrived as if the open day were a summons for her to deliver a judgment, not an invitation. She wore linen that could have been a banner and an expression tuned to indignation. She wandered the paths with a clipboard and a glare, cataloging perceived infractions with the zeal of someone taking inventory of a rival's sins. "Do you have permits for gatherings?" she demanded, as if asking the question could summon authority into being. "No permits required for a friendly afternoon," I said, offering the kindness of fact over the nastiness of argument. She sniffed and declared the event unsanctioned, which, in her mind, justified any outrage. A little boy tugged at her sleeve and asked bluntly, "Why do you have his keys?" For a beat she seemed undone, then produced the usual defense about protection. The child, who understands the world in sharper colors and fewer euphemisms than adults, offered her a slice of pie. She accepted it with a baffled courtesy that made her look both ridiculous and human. The image of her chewing a child's pie like a monarch weighing an edict lodged in my head for reasons I couldn't fully catalog. The open day shifted opinions more than I'd hoped. Neighbors who'd nodded at Karen's pronouncements were now asking how composting works and whether they could visit the orchard. Public sentiment in small communities is a slow-moving but decisive force. Once people touch the reality behind the rumor loses some of its venom. Karen had optics, but I had authenticity, and authenticity is sticky. Predictably, she escalated. The injunction went to court. The hearing felt like two different plays happening in the same courtroom, one script heavy on aesthetic displeasure and speculative market harm, the other grounded in deed records and historical surveys that traced my property back decade. Priya presented the documents with a clarity that made the judge lean forward. He read, compared maps, and then said what smaller minds might have thought obvious. The HOA had no covenant rights over my land. The injunction was denied. You would think a courtroom denial would end things. It didn't. Karen's response was a campaign of attrition, anonymous complaints about smells, petty notices left on the gate, a chorus of baseless calls to code enforcement. Each action was tiny on its own, but together they formed a rain meant to erode resolve. She treated community processes like a toolkit for harassment. I responded with patience and records. I photographed every notice, logged every call, and kept a dated diary of incidents with names of witnesses. When the sheriff's office quietly returned my keys in an envelope that smelled of administrative closure, I didn't throw a parade. I filed a complaint for theft and retaliation because patterns matter. One incident can be shrugged off. A pattern demonstrates intent. Getting the keys back didn't restore normalcy. It revealed how eagerly someone like Karen would weaponize institutions to assert control. The sheriff warned that escalations can move from paperwork to persistent personal attack. He advised keeping neighbors informed and documentation thorough. I suggested more pies. He laughed, then looked thoughtful, which I took as approval of both strategy and dessert. I mapped the next steps like a gardener planning seasons. Confirm the survey lines with the county clerk, print deed copies to share at meetings, and ask 2 neighbors who remembered the old dirt road to testify if needed. I drafted a factual flyer explaining what an HOA could and could not do, with citations from county code, because facts matter when people are being swayed by emotion. I scheduled a small workshop on sustainable fencing, knowing it would draw curious neighbors and provide an opportunity to explain boundaries calmly. I would be patient, visible, and unapologetically reasonable in every meeting possible. I thought the court ruling would be a turning point, a natural boundary drawn in ink and authority, but Karen treated it like a speed bump on her freeway to control. There are people who can admit defeat and pivot. Karen was built without that gene. What she had instead was a relentless belief in her own correctness, the kind that makes small disputes grow claws. The first big sign of escalation came on a Saturday morning so bright and calm it could have healed arguments just by existing. I woke up, brewed coffee, and stepped outside ready to enjoy normal life again. What I saw instead made me freeze mid-sip. A fence. Not just any fence. A brand new PVC white picket fence had been installed across the entire entrance to my driveway, complete with a sparkling HOA sign that looked like it belonged in a themed amusement park for suburban tyrants. And of course, there was a padlock on the gate engineered to keep out common sense. I walked closer, hoping maybe I was hallucinating. Nope. It was real enough to ruin my morning. A laminated note fluttered in the breeze, taped to the gate like a victory flag. Official HOA property line extension. No unauthorized vehicle transit. I read it twice because the first time felt like a prank. My driveway begins almost 70 feet inside my own land. But Karen had decided that because the subdivision road ended near my property, she could unilaterally extend their imaginary boundary. It was like she believed reality was bendable if she wrote enough notices. I did what any civilized person would do. I returned to the porch, set down my coffee, walked back to the fence with a bolt cutter, and removed the padlock with a single decisive crunch. The gate swung open like it had been waiting for someone rational to intervene. I moved it aside and drove to town like nothing had happened. When I came back an hour later, the fence was back. Same spot. New padlock. Karen was there too, hands on hips, flanked by 2 HOA board members who looked like backup singers in the musical number of Bad Decisions. "You are trespassing," she declared before I could even park. "This is my driveway," I said, gesturing to the very obvious acreage around us. "According to revised HOA mapping guidelines, that area falls under our jurisdiction," she insisted. "You need a permit to use it." "Karen," I said, "because sometimes names are powerful, you cannot redraw property lines with office supplies." Her lip curled. "That bolt cutter was destruction of HOA property. We will be filing charges." I considered arguing. Then I considered the beauty of silence. So I smiled, got back into my truck, and parked it in the field instead. The ground was soft, the engine rumbled contentedly, and Karen's face twisted like she had just tasted a lemon soaked in regret. That night, she launched the next phase. At exactly 8:15, Floodlights from the subdivision aimed directly at my barn lit up like a stadium had landed in the pasture. My animals freaked out. The goats ran around screaming. The cows stamped their feet in confusion. Chickens vibrated like feathered chaos. I walked across the road with measured calm, sheriff paperwork in hand. Karen opened her door holding a clipboard and wearing a shirt that said, Neighborhood Authority. I had never wanted to throw a shirt into a volcano so badly. You are causing a disturbance, I said evenly. I recommend shutting off the lights. We are illuminating a public nuisance, she replied. It is a matter of safety. Safety from what, grass shadows? She slammed the door. The lights stayed on. I drove to the station and filed another complaint. Deputy Romo sighed the sigh of someone whose patience has expiration date. We will check it out, he promised. By the time officers arrived, the lights were off, and Karen acted like she had never even heard of electricity. This dance continued for days. Lights on. Lights off. Fence up. Fence down. Notices appeared like mushrooms. Noise complaints filed, even though the only noise coming from my property was the occasional moo and a tractor engine half the neighborhood liked enough to comment on when it was fixed. Then came the drones. I was finishing an evening feeding when a high-pitched buzzing approached overhead. A small drone hovered above me like a mechanical vulture. Then a second. Then a third. A little squadron, cameras pointed down, clicking away like paparazzi documenting a scandal. I shouted up at them, which only succeeded in making me feel ridiculous, so I walked toward the subdivision. The drones followed me like entitled seagulls. Karen stood in her driveway, holding a controller and wearing pilot goggles that made her look like she was auditioning for a villain role in a low-budget spy movie. You are being surveilled for compliance, she announced. You are violating privacy laws, I said. She waved her hand like laws were merely suggestions she could edit. This time, I called Priya before contacting the sheriff. She did not laugh. Instead, she spoke slowly, which is what lawyers do when things become very real. She instructed me to record everything, photograph drones, log times, and prepare for the idea that we might need a restraining order. That night, as I tried to sleep, I thought about how people justify their worst behavior by convincing themselves they are the hero of the story. Karen believed she was saving her neighborhood from an invader. I was the invader. My family had farmed this land since before most of the subdivision residents were born, but in her mind tradition was a nuisance and nature was a blemish. The next morning I gathered 3 things: my coffee, my camera, and my resolve. I documented every fence, every floodlight, every drone flight. Neighbors began whispering. Some apologized quietly, admitting Karen had gone too far. Others avoided my eyes, afraid of choosing a side. But the truth about escalating conflict is that eventually neutrality becomes impossible. One evening, after feeding the goats, I found a new notice taped to the barn door. Not typed. Handwritten. The handwriting was sharp and angry. If you do not comply, we will make you. That was the moment I realized Karen was done playing with paperwork. She was preparing something bigger. Something that might not be reversible. And I was done waiting to react. The long game was shifting. It was time to move from defense to offense. Not with anger. Not with vandalism. But with the power of facts, law, and maybe, when the time was right, a little poetic justice that would make her question every decision that led her to this war she thought she could win. It was time to turn her greatest weapon against her. Her belief that she could not lose. I did not want destruction. I wanted understanding to land hard. People deserve boundaries. She would learn mine finally existed beyond paper and fences. A lesson written slowly. Delivered calmly. Accepted loudly. Respect grows when arrogance loses its mask. The restraining order felt like a clean line drawn in the mud, formal and resolute. For the first time in months there was a legal boundary Karen couldn't cross without immediate consequence. She reacted as predictable tyrants do, louder but less effective. When you remove someone's direct contact, they seek other outlet. The morning after the order, I found my property listed for sale on an online classified site. Someone had posted photos of my barn and the fields with a listing that claimed the land was vacant, ideal for development. There was a burner phone number and a proxy email. The listing smelled of rumor and cowardice. I printed screenshots. Priya helped draft a takedown request, and the site removed it within a day. Traces remained, though, and traces mattered. Next, unfamiliar trucks began circling slowly by the gate. Drivers claimed they were surveying or looking for a friend, which is administrative scribble for something else. One afternoon, I asked a man why he was photographing the compost heap. He stammered about investors and drove off when I said I'd call the sheriff. The pattern was obvious. Create a dossier, seed suspicion, make the place look unstable. I doubled down on visibility. If rumor thrives in shadow, shine counters it. I organized practical events: an orchard pruning class, a kids' harvest day, a tool repair clinic. People came. Neighbors who had mostly watched from across the street started helping load apple crates and teaching city kids how to drive a wheelbarrow without catastrophe. The farm became a place of ordinary usefulness rather than an object of gossip. Photos of smiling faces, not drone footage, began to populate the community chat. That simple pivot had another advantage: witnesses. People who now had skin in the game noticed odd vehicles and drone flights. They began to report sightings to the sheriff. Testimony is easier for people who care about something. Community investment turned passive observers into active documentarians. We accumulated statements, names, dates, descriptions, that painted a pattern rather than isolated incident. The harassment shifted into administrative attacks. An anonymous complaint landed at my bank claiming unpaid assessments. The bank, cautious, put a small hold on some routine transactions while they investigated. I met with the bank, handed over copies of deeds and tax records, and watched bureaucracy do its work. The hold lifted. My accountant muttered about the ugly efficiency of institutions when misused. Then the goats were moved. Not stolen exactly, but someone opened an outer gate and led them across a low ravine to a neighbor's clover patch before dawn. The neighbor called worried and apologetic. The goats were fine, if bewildered. But the act carried a message. Your animals are vulnerable and we can stage incidents that look accidental. Sheriff Daniels and his deputies investigated quickly. They found tire tracks, boot prints, and a fragment of a distinctive leaf matching bushes near Karen's property. A daycare provider from 2 houses down reported an early morning truck with fogged windows she hadn't recognized. Cross-referencing sightings turned noise into pattern and made circumstantial facts feel heavy. We pressed charges where the evidence allowed. Harassment, intimidation, interference with livestock. These aren't tacked-on nuisances in rural areas. They're offenses that worry prosecutors because they tend to escalate. The prosecutor reviewed the file and moved the case forward. For someone who had been weaponizing administrative channels, the law suddenly became costly. Karen's reaction was performative contrition. She filmed a shaky apology video, then pivoted to claim persecution once the comments turned. Her supporters splintered. People who had stood by her started whispering that perhaps she'd gone too far. The restraining order imposed distance. The criminal process imposed consequences. It would have been easy to confuse relief with victory, but I knew better. The legal system acts like a slow tide. It takes time to change the shore. I kept working on rebuilding social trust. I repaired a neighbor's sagging porch and helped an elderly woman plant winter onions. The small, ordinary acts of neighborliness are boring, but boring is the opposite of spectacle. It's what sustains communities. As the prosecutor advanced charges, something subtle shifted. The board's members who'd once nodded along with Karen began to avoid her public pronouncements. A few apologized privately. The online chat grew quieter. The devices of harassment, the drones, the anonymous listings, the padlocked gates, lost some of their potency when the neighborhood no longer echoed them. Even so, the campaign had left its mark. People had been frightened, routines had changed, and trust had cracked like thin ice. Restoring it would be slower than breaking it had been. I knew the next phase required patience and presence. Laws can restrain action, but they don't instantly repair relationship. So I continued the work of ordinary presence. I hosted a potluck after harvest where neighbors swapped recipes and gossip that was no longer weaponized. I invited Karen's neighbors who had been caught between loyalty and conscience to sit at my table. Some came. Others did not. But the ones who did left with jars of jam and a new practical knowledge of what the land really needed. Occasionally I'd see Karen on the periphery, watching as if studying a map she no longer controlled. She showed up at a community meeting and asked a pointed question about property lines, voice quivering in the way people do when they try to sound firm but feel uncertain. The judge's orders restricted her movements. She couldn't come near the barn or circulate drone footage. That constraint narrowed her options but didn't erase the bruises. One afternoon, a younger neighbor knocked on my door with an idea. She wanted to start a communal tool library in the old shed, an honest, useful resource where people could borrow ladders, drills, and pruning saws. The concept was practical and deeply communal. It would bind people through shared resources and reduce petty disputes over who owned what. I agreed and helped clear the shed. The first tool we cataloged was an antique hand saw donated by a family that had lived here for generations. The tool library drew people in. Borrowing and returning became a ritual that encouraged conversation about fence rails and plum trees, and those conversations did what filings and affidavits couldn't. They humanized the place. Quiet neighborliness does more to heal than any judge's order. I didn't celebrate. The charges worked their way through the court and the restraining order remained. The farm was still mine. The keys were my keys. But the conflict had taught me a private lesson. The defense of a place isn't merely about law or force. It's about refusing to let someone's insecurity become your daily weather. When I sat on the porch at dusk with a mug of tea and Daisy chewing contentedly in the distance, I felt the kind of tired satisfaction that comes from having done the right thing in the right way. The war had been ugly in parts, but the wins were durable because they were built on record, community, and stubborn kindness. Karen's campaigns had been meant to isolate and destabilize. Instead, they clarified who would stand with me and who would fade away. I was not naive. Contests like this leave scars and require maintenance. But the worst of the escalation had passed. The next moves would be about repair. Mending fences, building trust, and teaching neighbors the difference between vigilant care and petty domination. Those are small tasks, rarely photographed, but they keep a place from becoming something isomorphic and forgettable. They keep it alive. And if Karen tried another maneuver, the file on my table would be waiting, heavy with the weight of documented truth. Peace felt fragile. Peace felt fragile, and fragile things often break when someone decides they miss the sound of chaos more than the comfort of calm. For weeks, nothing dramatic happened. The restraining order held. The case advanced. The drones buzzed less often and eventually stopped altogether. Neighbors smiled more when they drove past. The farm returned to its rhythm, the kind that smelled of hay and dawn instead of conflict and paperwork. I let myself believe that normal had returned, even if it arrived with a limp instead of a confident stride. Then, one night, the universe reminded me that just because a fire looks dead doesn't mean the coals stopped burning. I woke to the sound of yelling at the gate. Not angry yelling, fearful yelling. The kind that comes from someone whose world flipped in an instant. I threw on boots, grabbed a flashlight, and ran toward the noise. The beam caught tangled figures near the entrance. A teenage boy was on the ground, clinging to his leg while two other kids hovered nearby, panic radiating from their voices. The boy's bike lay twisted against the fence. The culprit was a strand of new barbed wire stretched low across the entrance like a snare. I knelt to assess the damage. Deep cuts. Not life-threatening, but painful and stupidly unnecessary. The boy explained between gasps that they had been biking on the public road when his tire caught on the wire. The placement was meticulous. It was meant to trap someone. Someone entering or leaving my property. I called an ambulance, then the sheriff. While we waited, I walked the perimeter with my flashlight. More wire. Shallow pits dug near the orchard. A rope dropped from a branch at neck height near the barn path. Trap. Not random harassment anymore. Intent to harm. When the ambulance left, the sheriff stayed. He paced the scene slowly, jaw clenched tight enough to crack a tooth. This isn't petty anymore, he said. Someone set traps that could maim or kill. We both knew who that someone likely was. But law doesn't work on likely. It works on proof. And while suspicion is loud, evidence whispers until it gathers into a chorus. You need more cameras, he said. Everywhere. Visible ones and hidden ones. Document everything, even the quiet nights. The next morning, I installed more cameras than a reality TV mansion. Some high enough to catch glimpses from afar, others disguised among branches or tucked under barn eaves. If anything moved wrong, technology would notice. Days passed. I reinforced fences. I replaced locks. For a while, nothing unusual happened beyond animals complaining about my increased vigilance. Then, one night near midnight, one of the new cameras sent a motion alert to my phone. The silhouette on the screen was familiar even in the low resolution. Karen's posture, rigid as a ruler, accompanied by two figures holding clipboards like night auditors of lunacy. They were measuring the distance from the subdivision road to my ditch as if the earth would bend to their will if documented in triplicate. The next evening, a notice appeared accusing me of damaging community safety equipment, which was their new term for the snares and pits I had removed. The absurdity would have been funny if not for blood still fresh in my memory. I printed the notice, logged it, and filed another report. Around this time, the HOA board began publicly unraveling. 2 members abruptly resigned. Their explanations were vague, but resignation has a tone that everyone understands. Enough. One wrote me an apology letter, shaking handwriting full of regret and exhaustion. It ended with a line I read twice because of its weight. Fear made us follow her. Fear also broke us. Karen did not break. She doubled down. She started holding late-night gatherings on her driveway with a few remaining loyalists. They whispered like conspirators drawing battle maps with chalk and paranoia. My cameras caught glimpses of them gesturing toward my barn. They weren't retreating, they were reorganizing. The very next morning, I discovered every mailbox in the subdivision stuffed with flyers claiming my farm was contaminated. Fake letters from non-existent environmental testers warned of hazardous animal waste runoff. Photoshopped images showed green sludge oozing from my barn like I was running a radioactive waste center instead of a dairy operation. Some neighbors laughed it off. Others looked worried. Rumors don't need logic, only oxygen. Priya advised a measured response. She drafted a cease and desist letter heavy with legal menace. I posted real inspection results online, clear and certified. Slowly, the truth reclaimed ground that fear had stolen. But Karen wasn't satisfied. She needed a bigger stage. The county commission meeting arrived like a test. Karen appeared with binders, diagrams, and a performance that would have made a reality TV villain proud. She painted me as a reckless anarchist running an illegal farm designed to destroy property values. Every exaggerated claim was dramatic, confident, and wrong. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't try to match her volume. I brought facts. I brought history. I brought people. Kids who had fed my goats stood behind me holding postcards of apple blossoms they picked on my land. A retired teacher described how the farm educated children. A neighbor with a garden patch talked about soil and shared seed. When Daisy mooed from just outside the window at the perfect comedic moment, even the commissioners smiled. Karen's binders lost their magic. The commission reaffirmed my land rights unanimously. Her defeat was clean, public, undeniable. And yet, I didn't celebrate. because I had seen the look in her eyes as she listened. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was desperation. People who cling to control the tightest are the ones most terrified of losing themselves without it. She had built her identity on being the savior of the subdivision. Now, in front of everyone, that identity cracked like thin ice under heavy boot. That night, the farm was quiet. Too quiet. Even the goats seemed aware that storms often come after the calm, not before. I checked every lock, every fence line, every alarm. I walked the property until my legs complained. I slept in short fragments, waking to scan the camera feeds, expecting the next strike. It happened just before dawn. A furious pounding on my door ripped me from sleep. Sheriff Daniels stood there, face grim, voice stripped of patience. "We need you at the station," he said. "Right now." My stomach tightened. "What's happened?" "A break-in," he replied. "At the HOA office." My pulse slowed in confusion. "Why would I need to?" "Because they found something," he said, looking at me with that expression cops wear when they're carrying news they don't fully believe themselves. "What did they find?" He exhaled. "Evidence. A lot of it. Karen's kept record. Photos. Note. Plans. And your name is on every page." Then the kicker. "She tried to frame you." Suddenly, this wasn't just harassment anymore. It was war, and the final strike was coming. When a sheriff looks at you the way Daniels looked at me that morning, you learn quickly that fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it creeps in quiet, like frost on a window, until everything beyond the glass feels distant. I followed him to the station with the numb focus of someone walking through a dream that didn't ask for permission to become real. Inside an interview room, a stack of binders sat on the table. Not random binders. HOA blue binders, perfectly labeled in Karen's aggressive handwriting. One read Case Against Farm, another Behavioral Evidence, and the thickest said Subdivision Safety Master Plan. Daniels gestured to the pile. These were locked in a cabinet she smashed herself. She triggered the alarm. When officers arrived, she was inside claiming she found all this evidence, proving you were sabotaging the neighborhood. I opened the first binder. Every page was a delusion laminated into permanence. Photos of my barn taken at odd angles to make shadows look like violations. Notes describing me as radical, unstable, and potentially dangerous. Pages accusing me of hoarding hazardous chemicals, actually just fertilizer bags zoomed in for sinister effect. She'd printed screenshots from my farm's website and circled words like harvest and processing as if they implied criminal activity. She wasn't building a case. She was building a villain. And she had decided that villain was me. Daniels slid another folder across the table. Inside were maps, detailed layouts of my property with handwritten arrows showing entry points, blind spots, camera locations, plans for fencing expansions, a schedule tracking my daily routines. It was intelligence work without intelligence. Underneath the maps was something that made bile rise in my throat. A printed message draft. Anonymous concerned citizen. It accused me of storing illegal weapons on site. It included a list of farm tools she planned to photograph as proof: shovels, saws, hedge trimmers. She had been preparing to call federal agencies. She was escalating to authorities who don't show up with clipboards. "Why?" I whispered, mostly to the room. Daniels answered softly. "Control. Fear. She convinced herself you were a threat because she needed you to be one." They had arrested her. She was in a holding cell awaiting processing. The prosecutor was already assembling charges: trespassing, stalking, criminal harassment, reckless endangerment. The case was no longer a stack of petty complaints. It was a wall of crimes, each brick heavier than the last. "You'll need to testify," Daniels said. "There'll be hearings. Probably a trial." I nodded. Legal battles didn't scare me anymore. Real threats did. And Karen had crossed from nuisance into danger long before the law caught up. He gave me copies of the most relevant documents and told me I was free to go. But freedom felt like a door that never closed all the way, not when someone like Karen had already walked through it once. I drove home slowly. The fields looked the same. The animals grazed with their usual cheerful lack of awareness. But I wasn't the same. Neither was the neighborhood. 2 police cars were parked near the HOA entrance, lights off, serving a silent reminder that the story wasn't over. By afternoon, the news had spread in the way wildfire spreads, quickly and without regard for privacy. Neighbors watched from driveways, exchanging theories. Some expressed genuine relief. Some wore guilt like a heavy coat. Others had the decency to look embarrassed that they ever believed the flyers, the notices, the rumors. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. That evening, I heard footsteps on gravel. I turned to see a man I barely knew from the subdivision, hands tucked awkwardly in his jacket pocket. "I wanted to apologize," he said. "I voted for her. I thought she was trying to help. I didn't realize." He stopped, unable to finish. I didn't need him to. "Fear makes people believe strange things," I said quietly. He looked relieved that I wasn't making him grovel. He nodded, thanked me, and turned to leave. Before he did, he said, "The neighborhood owes you better." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a seed. Night brought silence with rough edges. I sat on the porch, tea cooling in my hands, listening for any sign that the past months might suddenly come crashing back. I watched every shadow like it might move wrong. But the only sounds were the wind brushing the wheat and Daisy huffing as she settled into sleep. For the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel like a warning. A week later, the court hearing for the restraining order extension arrived. Karen appeared in shackles, hair pulled into something that tried and failed to present control. She didn't look like a villain anymore. She looked small, tired, fragile in a way entitlement never allowed her to appear before. Her lawyer argued mental stress, delusion, pressure from the HOA role. He requested treatment rather than punishment. Priya argued safety, documentation, intent and danger from a woman who believed she was justified in anything she did. The judge extended the order, broadened its scope, and scheduled further criminal proceedings. Karen was banned from any form of contact or proximity to me or my property. The HOA officially removed her from the presidency. When she was escorted out, she glanced at me, just once. Not with hatred. With confusion. As if she still didn't understand that the monster she hunted wasn't real. She had invented it, fed it, and still didn't realize it lived only in her own reflection. Not long after, the HOA held an emergency election. A new president took over, a reasonable man who apologized in a voice that had clearly practiced sincerity. He promised cooperation, boundaries, and a return to reality. I agreed to meet halfway. Peace is easier when both sides remember why fences exist. Life slowly returned to what it had been before Karen decided she needed an enemy to prove her importance. Kids biked past the gate without suspicion. Neighbors volunteered during lambing season. The tool library expanded. The orchard bloomed. The farm breathed again. And I realized something while repairing a fence one afternoon, sweat mixing with sawdust under the sun. Victory isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a barn door closing without a lock. Sometimes it's a cow snorting contentedly at dust moat. Sometimes it's just knowing you can rest without fear that someone will set traps in the dark. The long game had worked, not by crushing her, but by standing firm while she exhausted every misguided attempt to break me. I don't know what the future holds for Karen. I hope she finds the help she needs. I hope she learns that control isn't the same as respect, and fear isn't the same as leadership. But if she ever tries stepping across my fence again, well, my cameras work beautifully now, and I never leave my keys unattended.